if you ask someone to, like, picture Australia, they almost always pull up one of two totally distinct images, you know?
Right, yeah, like two different worlds.
Exactly. Like, one is this sun-drenched, postcard-perfect harbor, water sparkling under a completely cloudless sky, with that famous white sail-shaped opera house just, glistening in the background.
Classic Sydney.
Right. But then the other image is entirely different. It's this narrow, graffiti-covered brick laneway, totally packed with people wearing like layered, immaculate black clothing.
Yeah, usually holding a coffee.
Always holding a coffee, sipping on the most complex, single-origin flat white you've ever tasted.
It's the ultimate Australian heavyweight bout, really. I mean, you've got Sydney with its undeniable, extroverted natural beauty going up against Melbourne with its introverted, underground, creative brains.
And it's a rivalry that has raged for, wow, well over a century at this point.
Oh, at least. People take it very seriously.
They really do. Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you actually sit down and look at the data, and we have a massive stack of it for today's deep dive, from, Bureau of Meteorology, climate records, to architectural histories, streetwear cultural analyses, and even international academic studies, you realize these stereotypes actually hide some incredible counterintuitive truths.
Yeah, the data paints a very different picture than the marketing campaigns.
Exactly. Our mission today is to figure out, are we just buying into decades of clever city marketing, or are the invisible forces of geography, climate, and mid-century union strikes actually dictating how these cities feel to you when you walk down the street?
To truly understand the DNA of a city, you have to look way past the tourism brochures. A city isn't just, a collection of buildings. It's a reaction to its environment.
Right.
So the weather patterns dictate the zoning laws dictate the architecture, and the architecture literally dictates what you wear when you walk out your front door.
That makes total sense. So let's start with the most obvious invisible force, which is the weather.
Right, the big one.
The foundational complaint leveled against Melbourne is that it's this gloomy, rainy, miserable place, like practically London with a slight accent.
Which Melbourne locals absolutely hate hearing, by the way.
I bet. Meanwhile, Sydney is supposedly this, endless summer paradise. But when I looked at the actual Bureau of Meteorology numbers you pulled for this, that entire narrative just completely fractured.
It's a brilliant example of perception versus statistical reality. I mean, let's just look at the sheer math of sunshine. According to the Bureau of Meteorology, Sydney gets an average of 2,639 hours of sunshine a year.
Okay.
But Melbourne gets 2,384 hours.
Wait, that's a difference of just 255 hours over an entire year.
Exactly. When you break it down, it's roughly 21 extra days of sunshine a year for Sydney.
That is hardly the night and day, totally different climate zone difference people always claim.
Not at all.
And here is the real kicker that honestly stopped me in my tracks. Sydney is actually wetter than Melbourne. It has a significantly higher total rainfall volume.
It sure does.
So wait, Sydney actually gets more rain, but Melbourne gets the gloomy reputation. How does the city that technically receives more water constantly brag about its endless summer? That math doesn't seem to check out.
It comes down to the mechanics of how the rain actually falls, and it's driven entirely by the underlying geography. Sydney's rain is violent and efficient.
Violent and efficient. I like that.
Yeah, because of the warm ocean currents and the way the mountains trap the coastal air, Sydney gets intense torrential downpours. They get heavy thunderstorms, particularly in the warmer months where the sky just unzips.
Wow.
But then it abruptly stops. The storm breaks, the clouds part, and the sun comes blazing back out.
So it rains heavily, but it just gets it out of its system quickly.
Exactly. Melbourne's precipitation operates on a completely different mechanical level. It frequently falls as light, fleeting convective showers, basically misty drizzles.
Ah, okay. The annoying kind of rain.
Right. In fact, Melbourne has 139 days of rain a year that barely even hit the 0.2 millimeter threshold. It's just enough to make the pavement jamp and, force you to carry an umbrella, but it rarely washes the city away.
I saw a Reddit user in one of the threads we analyzed describe this perfectly. They said, Melbourne's weather is like a moody but apologetic partner.
That is painfully accurate.
Right. It's unpredictable, it changes its mind constantly, but it quickly self-restrains before doing any real damage. Sydney, on the other hand, is that intense, volatile partner where when it's good, it's breathtaking, but when it's bad, when it rains, it absolutely pours.
Right.
Relentlessly.
That is a highly accurate meteorological analogy, actually.
Okay.
Melbourne is globally famous for having, 4 seasons in one day. And the reason why is fascinating.
That's the geography again, right?
Yep, it sits right on the geographical boundary between the scorching hot inland deserts of the Australian continent and the freezing cold Southern Ocean.
So it's basically a giant atmospheric battleground.
Precisely. You have cold pools of air crossing the state from Antarctica, violently clashing with extreme daytime heating from the desert.
Wow.
And because there are no massive mountain ranges protecting Melbourne to the south or the north, you get a massive temperature drop, sometimes like 15 degrees Celsius in a matter of minutes when the wind shifts.
That is wild.
And then there's a phenomenon that meteorologists call anticyclonic gloom.
Anticyclonic gloom. I gotta say, that sounds less like a weather pattern and more like a symptom you'd bring up to a therapist.
It certainly feels like one to the locals who endure it. But here's how it works mechanically. In winter, massive high-pressure systems sit to Melbourne's north and west.
Okay.
Think of a high-pressure system like a heavy, invisible lid sitting over the region. It traps a layer of relatively warm air at a high altitude.
Right.
That warm air holds moisture rolling in off the Bass Strait, and because of that heavy lid, it just can't rise and burn off. It sits there, creating a thick blanket of low-level cloud cover.
Ah, so that's where the reputation comes from. The sunshine hours might be close on paper, but those daylight hours in Melbourne are fighting through a massive ceiling of gray skies.
Exactly. It gives Melbourne about 180 overcast days a year.
And the nature of the heat itself is totally different too, isn't it?
Completely. Sydney is encircled by the Great Dividing Range to its west. These mountains restrict the airflow moving inland, essentially trapping the coastal air against the ocean.
So it gets muggy.
Extremely. When summer hits, it gets incredibly uncomfortably humid. You step outside and immediately start sweating. Melbourne's heat, conversely, is driven down from the central desert by strong, dry, northerly winds.
So it's a dry heat.
Right. It feels like opening an oven door.
So if you're packing your bags or, say, deciding where to take a job, this invisible data completely changes things. If you absolutely hate suffocating humidity, Melbourne is going to be far more comfortable for you.
Absolutely.
But if waking up to gray, overcast skies ruins your mood, you need to head to Sydney, even if it means dodging a massive thunderstorm now and then.
And, that anticyclonic gloom doesn't just dictate whether you carry an umbrella. It actively forced a completely different approach to how Melburnians built their city and how they live in it.
Which brings us to the built environment. And one of the strangest historical ironies in urban planning.
Yeah, this part is fascinating.
It blew my mind. When you look at aerial photos today, Melbourne looks like a grid of hyper-modern skyscrapers hiding a maze of Victorian-era laneways.
Right.
But Sydney, on the other hand, has these beautifully preserved, historic, winding colonial streets right on the edge of a massive global financial district. But it was almost the exact opposite, wasn't it?
It was. The story of how these two cities look today involves staggering wealth, post-war modernization, and a highly unlikely alliance that literally saved Sydney's soul.
Let's wind the clock back to Melbourne in the 1880s first. At the time, it was known globally as Marvelous Melbourne.
Yeah, they really leaned into that title.
Fueled by the Victorian gold rush, the city was just flush with astronomical amounts of cash. The historical sources ascribe it as being considered the most American city in Australia at the time.
Because of the architecture.
Right. They were building these brash, ostentatious, highly ornamented skyscrapers in a style architects actually call the boom style.
Yeah, and boom style was all about showing off new wealth. Think of massive stucco parapets, which is essentially just cheap plaster molded to look like expensive hand-carved European stone-colored bricks, intricate wrought iron and stained glass just everywhere.
They were really going for it.
Oh, yeah. They were actively trying to rival the grand, wealthy cities of Chicago and New York.
But if you walk around Melbourne today, you definitely don't see a sprawling metropolis of 1880s boom-style towers. So what happened to it?
Well, fast forward to the mid-20th century. Post-war modernization was basically the new global religion. Melbourne's civic leaders looked at this ornate, heavily decorated Victorian architecture and decided it was completely outmoded, embarrassing, and unmodern.
So they just got rid of it.
Pretty much. Much of that incredible heritage was quietly and systematically demolished. There was a famous local demolition firm called Whelan the Wrecker.
Whelan the Wrecker. Great name.
Right. For decades, they essentially dismantled Melbourne's historic core brick by brick, replacing those ornate Boone-style buildings with plain, functional glass and steel modern office blocks.
Which brings us to the ultimate paradox. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you'd assume Sydney, being the global financial hub, the city obsessed with commerce and prime real estate, would have bulldozed its history even faster to build shiny towers.
You would think so.
But in the 1970s, Sydney actually saved its historic heart. Places like the Rocks, the colonial streets of Glebe and Centennial Park. And it wasn't because of some enlightened, forward-thinking government planning committee, was it?
No, not at all. It was saved by rogue union action, specifically the Builders Laborers Federation, or the BLF.
Hold on. So the tough working-class construction unions, the literal guys pouring concrete, erecting scaffolding, and driving bulldozers were the ones fighting to save fancy historic buildings and parks, while the establishment wanted to bulldoze them into Hong Kong-style high-rises.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
It is an incredible clash of competing visions for the city's future.
And we should definitely just stick to the facts here, because it was highly political.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So factually speaking, on one side, you had the conservative state government led by Premier Robert Askin, who was heavily promoting rapid, high-density economic development.
Right.
They looked at these older, working-class colonial areas right on the harbor and saw them as prime, underutilized real estate, perfect for luxury condominiums and high-rise office towers.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you had the BLF, led by a union secretary named Jack Mundy.
Yeah.
Between 1971 and 1975, the BLF instituted what they called green bans.
Green bans.
Yeah. They embraced broader social and environmental causes, arguing that the people actually building the city had a moral right to decide what kind of city it should be. So they simply refused to work on any project that they believed destroyed community heritage or the natural environment.
Wow.
If a developer wanted to tear down a 19th century pub to build a parking garage, the union just wouldn't provide the labor. The sites sat empty.
And the historical sources make it clear this was not just, a polite disagreement over zoning laws with some picket signs. It was a brutal, bare-knuckle fight.
Very brutal.
There was the battle for the Rocks, involving mass arrests and barricades, and it even spiraled into a very dark, unsolved mystery.
You're referring to Juanita Nielsen.
Yes. She was a local publisher and a wealthy heiress who passionately championed the green bans. She actively campaigned against massive developments in King's Cross, rallying the community. And then in 1975, she completely disappeared.
It's a tragic story.
It really is. She was last seen attending a meeting at a club owned by a prominent organized crime figure, and her body was never found. It just highlights exactly how high the stakes were. Hundreds of millions of dollars were on the line.
It was a deeply turbulent era. Eventually, the National Union leadership, under a man named Norm Gallagher, stepped in. They dismissed the local New South Wales leaders, broke the bans, and aligned with the developers to get the men back to work.
So the developers won in the end?
Well, they won the battle, but they lost the war. The delay caused by those strikes lasted just long enough for public opinion to completely shift.
Oh, I see.
The green bans ultimately forced the creation of modern heritage and environmental protection laws in New South Wales. The Heritage Act of 1977 and the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act of 1979 were direct causal results of those striking laborers.
That's incredible.
Because of the BLF, Sydney retained its intact historical districts on the harbor. Meanwhile, Melbourne, which didn't have a similar movement at that scale during its demolition wave, lost much of its original Victorian core.
It is a massive historical role reversal. So we've seen how they were built and what they destroyed or managed to save. But how does that legacy affect what they are building today? Because the architecture happening right now in these cities couldn't be more different.
Oh, it's night and day. When you look at modern architecture in these two cities today, you see two wildly different regulatory philosophies. Melbourne is generally seen by the architectural community as more innovative and, experimental.
Right.
You have striking, sometimes aggressively weird geometric designs by firms like ARM. Think of Federation Square. It's iconic, it's completely asymmetrical, and it's highly polarizing. Some people love it, some people hate it, but it takes a risk.
And why are they allowed to take those risks?
Because Melbourne's planning system is less prescriptive. They use performance-based guidelines. As long as a building achieves certain broad goals, the architect has the flexibility to experiment with form and materials.
Whereas Sydney operates on a literal 180-page rulebook called SEPP 65, the Apartment Design Guide. And reading through what this guide actually mandates is just fascinating. It's incredibly detailed.
It really is. It dictates the exact mathematics of cross-ventilation, how many hours of sun ingress a living room must get in midwinter, the exact minimum dimensions of a balcony.
And practically what that means is that a SEPI 65 compliant building is incredibly comfortable to live in. The air circulation is great, the natural light is maximized. But architects argue it acts as a strict, unavoidable template.
Right, because if every building has to meet the exact same mathematical formula for balconies and windows, eventually they all start to look like the exact same glossy, predictable glass box.
Exactly.
Which leads me to a theory I want to run by you. Does Sydney's reliance on its spectacular natural beauty, like the harbor, the beaches, the headlands, make it culturally lazy when it comes to creative design?
It's a highly debated point in urban design circles, actually, but there's a very strong argument for it. Sydney builds and dresses for the outside world. It leans entirely into its natural geographic advantages.
Right. You don't need to build a wildly experimental, avant-garde building to attract people if you can just put floor-to-ceiling glass windows facing the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
Good point.
And you see this exact same philosophy reflected directly in the streetwear culture of both cities.
Oh man, the streetwear analysis we reviewed was so revealing. It scored the cities across various fashion categories, and Melbourne overwhelmingly won 5-2. It completely dominates daily street style and independent brands.
Yep.
But how does a city's geography actually dictate the fabric and cuts of the clothes people wear?
It's about necessity and environment. The analysis pointed out that Melbourne lacks a massive, stunning harbor right in its center to act as a focal point. Combine that with the anticyclonic gloom and the unpredictable drizzle we talked about, and Melburnians are forced to burrow inward. They spend more time indoors, in cafes, in galleries, in bars.
So you have to create your own visual interests.
Exactly. You curate your outfit because you are the scenery. Melbourne culture rewards intentional, layered, creative dressing.
And the laneways play a role too, right?
Huge role. Those famous laneways provide smaller, slightly cheaper commercial footprints. This creates an economic ecosystem that allows niche, independent fashion labels to actually survive and thrive, supported by a dense network of local fashion schools.
But Sydney didn't lose every category. Sydney took the prize for coastal and lifestyle streetwear.
Naturally. Because Sydney's beach culture isn't just a marketing performance, it's genuine daily life. People are actually waking up at 6 a.m., surfing at Manly, running along the Bondi to Coogee Coastal Walk, and then going to get coffee.
That sounds exhausting, honestly.
Maybe, but they are living a highly active outdoor lifestyle. So their streetwear naturally evolves to be cleaner, more relaxed, and highly functional. It's oversized, breathable tees, clean sneakers, technical caps. They dress for the environment.
So to connect the dots, Sydney doesn't need to try as hard with its clothes or its architecture because the environment does the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
Melbourne, dealing with moody weather and lacking that giant natural centerpiece, had to actively manufacture a culture. They had to build labyrinthine laneways, foster intense independent fashion, and commission wild architectural experiments just to keep things interesting.
That's the crux of it. Melbourne dresses for itself.
Yeah.
Sydney dresses for the environment. Which brings us to the ultimate, most contentious heavyweight title.
Oh boy.
Is Melbourne truly the undisputed cultural and art capital of Australia, as it claims? Or is Sydney quietly stealing the crown while Melbourne rests on its laurels?
This is where civic pride always clashes with the facts. The old, tired saying goes, Melbourne has the culture, Sydney has the commerce. But our sources, particularly the academic comparative studies, tell a much more complex story. Let's look at the tourism versus livability debate.
The consensus we pulled from massive Reddit threads captures this dichotomy perfectly. Tourists often arrive in Sydney and are instantly blown away. You see the Opera House, you take a ferry across the sparkling water. It is an immediate visceral wow factor.
But the knock on Sydney is that once you get past that glossy surface, it can be a tough, expensive place to actually live day to day.
Right. Melbourne, conversely, is described by locals and travelers as a slow burn city. It requires digging.
Digging.
Yeah, like a tourist might walk down a gray street and see nothing, but a local knows which unmarked graffiti-covered door leads to a basement that houses the best cocktail bar in the Southern Hemisphere.
That makes sense.
It's highly livable, richly textured for residents, but it can be confusing or underwhelming for a tourist who just wants a quick photo op.
In fact, one Reddit user noted they felt Melbourne had actually gone downhill recently, citing state financial issues, messy graffiti rather than art, and a drop in civic pride. But let's talk about that art scene, because Melbourne is world famous for its street art.
Very famous.
Hosier Lane is practically a pilgrimage site for creatives. They even have the massive Regiful Silo Art Trail out in the country.
They do, but academic sources suggest this street art ecosystem in Melbourne is becoming highly mythologized.
How so?
It's facing a bit of a crisis, becoming almost a curated caricature of itself to appease tourists, rather than a genuine underground movement. Meanwhile, Sydney is quietly booming in this exact space.
Wait, really? Where? Because you don't think of Sydney as a street art hub at all.
Look at inner-city suburbs like St. Peter's, specifically Mary Lane, and Surrey Hills. They have become massive, dynamic hubs for street art.
Oh, wow.
And it's largely driven by local business owners, turning old factory walls into open-air galleries, fostering a really raw, energetic scene, while Melbourne is arguably stagnating.
And then there's the most sensitive topic of all, the coffee.
Oh, tread lightly here.
I know. If you suggest to a Melburnian that someone else's coffee is better, those are fighting words. They invented the modern flat white culture. But a recent academic comparative analysis noted that Sydney is actually overtaking Melbourne in the culinary and specialty coffee scene. How is that even possible?
The data argues that Sydney is much better at integrating global trends because it's a more outward-facing city. For example, Toby's estate in Chippendale, Sydney, was recently named the world's best coffee shop.
Okay, that's huge.
It is. The academic critique of Melbourne is that it sometimes gets guilty of conserving its own local formats. They do what they do incredibly well, but that scene can feel insular. They can fiercely resist external innovation because they believe they've already perfected it.
Interesting. And we can't ignore the sheer scale of Sydney's geography when we talk about livability either.
No, you can't.
We always hear about the 12 Apostles in Victoria, this stunning coastal rock formation. But to see it, you have to commit to a multi-hour road trip down the Great Ocean Road.
Right.
Meanwhile, Sydney has coastal cliffs at South Head that are literally twice as high as the 12 Apostles.
And you can get there on a 30-minute ferry ride from the Central Business District for a few dollars.
It's crazy.
The accessibility of world-class natural wonder in Sydney is simply unparalleled globally, let alone in Australia.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? If someone is planning a trip or even a relocation and they're looking at all this data, the weather, the architecture, the culture, how do they choose?
It entirely depends on your specific bandwidth and what you value. If you want a visually spectacular, fast-paced, instantly gratifying experience,
it's Sydney.
Right? If you want to see iconic landmarks, eat at globally recognized outward-facing restaurants, and spend your days seamlessly transitioning from a corporate office to pristine beaches, you choose Sydney.
But if you want depth?
If you have the time to peel back the layers, yes. If you care deeply about finding independent arts, discovering hidden boutiques that don't exist anywhere else, experiencing an unparalleled local music scene, and you want to feel a world-class, highly livable, intentionally creative vibe, you choose Melbourne.
It really seems like Sydney and Melbourne are two completely different responses to the Australian continent.
That's a great way to put it.
On one side, you have Sydney, the extroverted powerhouse. It's a city shaped by its stunning harbor, paradoxically protected by strict planning laws born from 1970s working-class strikes, and living a lifestyle that is genuinely, effortlessly coastal.
Yep.
And on the other side, you have Melbourne, the introverted, creative thinker. A city shaped by unpredictable weather and anti-cyclonic gloom, forced to look inward, building a fiercely independent culture of art, fashion, and architectural experimentation right there in its hidden laneways.
And while locals will undoubtedly continue to argue over which city is definitively better, I'd like to leave you with a different way to look at it.
Oh.
Consider how this century-old rivalry is actually the very thing forcing both of these cities to evolve.
What do you mean, like a sibling rivalry pushing them to compete?
Exactly. Think about the mechanisms of competition. Without the constant pressure of Sydney's global dominance, without Sydney effortlessly stealing the international spotlight and the tourist dollars, would Melbourne have pushed so incredibly hard to become such a fierce cultural innovator? Would they have invested so heavily in their arts, their fashion, and their culinary identity if they could have just relied on a pretty harbor?
Probably not. They had to compensate. They had to build a cultural engine because they didn't have the geographical lottery ticket.
And conversely, without Melbourne constantly winning those most livable city in the world awards year after year and proving that a city can be an intellectual and cultural haven, Would Sydney be trying so hard to reform its urban planning today?
That's true.
Would Sydney be focusing so much money and effort on activating its own laneways and nurturing its independent art scenes in places like Surrey Hills if Melbourne wasn't constantly making them look culturally shallow?
So the truth is, they desperately need each other.
They absolutely do. It invites a broader question about urban development. Can a city ever truly achieve greatness without a rival pushing it forward? The tension between Sydney's postcard perfection and Melbourne's underground brains isn't a problem to be solved. It's the very engine that drives Australia's urban culture forward.
A heavyweight bout where the real winner is anyone who gets to spend time in both. Definitely something to mull over the next time you're zipping up a black jacket in a drizzly alleyway or, catching a ferry across a sun-drenched harbor. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.